Hey guys, it's Waviver, welcome back. Today we're gonna do some VR game benchmarks with the RTX 2080 Ti, the MSI Gaming X Trio version that I just got and plugged into my computer, as you probably have spotted already. All the benchmarks are going to be compared against the GTX 1080 Ti, also the MSI Gaming X, my previous and second graphic card that I got here. And of course, all the VR benchmarks are going to be made with the Pimax headsets, the best PC hardware with the best VR headsets on the market. We're going to try out 10 different games plus a bonus game actually. We're going to compare them with different title values or resolutions, and we're going to see how much you can gain from going from a GTX 1080 Ti overclocked to an RTX 2080 Ti also heavily overclocked. That's the question here today. Before we begin, I would like to ask you, please subscribe to my channel and also leave a like on this video. Huge thanks to all my Patreon supporters and of course my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. Guys, let's do this. So finally it arrived, my MSI RTX 2080 Ti Gaming X Trio, which I pre-ordered almost a month ago, but due to delays the waiting has been quite frustrating. This beautiful piece of electronics does not come for free though. I paid around 1400 euro for this toy, which is maybe 1500 bucks in the United States. But hey, Pimax 8K and 5K plus VR headsets are quite GPU demanding, and whatever performance boost I can gain, I will pay for it, I guess. Well, call me stupid, but that's how it is being a VR enthusiast. First off, I won't go much into the specifications or the details about this GPU in this video, as you most likely already know all about this graphic card, so I don't think it really needs any introduction, but let me just sum it up. The RTX 2080 Ti is the new flagship graphic card among the latest consumer-grade GPU generation from Nvidia, which is supposed to give us between 25 and 50% boost in frame rate performance while gaming, compared to the latest generation flagship GTX 1080 Ti. But in terms of VR gaming, not much has been said or proven so far, and while I have seen a bunch of VR benchmarks with the RTX 2080 Ti on YouTube, especially those made by Thomas running the German YouTube channel Voodoo.de, I gotta say the numbers doesn't look impressive. As I already have a GTX 1080 Ti overclocked above 2 GHz, the gap between 1080 Ti and the new 2080 Ti might even be smaller. But let's not lose the hopes just yet. By the way, I know what you're thinking, new hardware for Waviver means new unboxing, right? Well, how about skipping that one today as well? I was actually planning to do an unboxing video of this card, but honestly, I feel there is not much in this box worth being mentioned. Basically, we have a small 6-pin to 8-pin power cable, a support bracket I probably won't use anyway, some uninteresting papers, warranty stuff, and a CD I won't be able to check out even, as I ditched my CD-ROM drive years ago. Oh, and well, we have the GPU in the box of course, and I gotta say it's huge. The MSI RTX 2080 Ti Gaming X Trio must be the biggest GPU I have ever seen, and I'm quite happy my full tower case fits it, especially considering its length. It's heavy as well, and my old MSI GTX 1080 Ti Gaming X looks really small in comparison. Also, the GPU has loads of LED lights and bling bling, and 3 big fans and metal backplate. Not that I really care about the looks of the graphic cards in general, as I'm more into the performance only, but hey, I gotta admit it looks quite cool once you put it in the case and turn it on, don't you think? Anyways, I think you're here for the VR benchmark results more than the close-up photos, which you have probably seen more than enough already. I promise I will go straight on the point in this video without making it unnecessarily long or boring. But let me just talk about the testing itself. As mentioned in the intro, we're gonna have a look at how 10 different VR games performs running on the Pimax headsets and how the performance differs between the 1080 Ti and the 2080 Ti. Both GPUs are overclocked to its maximum with the EVGA Precision X1 software, where the GTX 1080 Ti runs at 2 GHz and the RTX 2080 Ti boosts around 2100 MHz, sometimes more, sometimes less. You may know this already, but the Pimax 5K Plus has 90Hz display, which means it uses a higher refresh rate than the Pimax 8K and it's 80Hz. So this is also the only reason I decided to do all the benchmarks on the 5K Plus this time. Basically to be able to show you if games can achieve 90 frames per second stable. And if the games can run at 90 frames per second, of course 80 frames per second won't be a problem to achieve on the Pimax 8K either. Together with the Pimax 5K Plus, I'm using the latest Python software available right now, the version 101.76, and upon all benchmarks I have made for today, I updated the Nvidia drivers to the latest 416.34, which theoretically should give us optimal performance. Furthermore, 3 different resolutions or Python render quality values have been used and recorded in each game during these testings. Python at 1.0, which is default, Python 1.25 and Python 1.5. The maximum render quality possible is Python 2.0 of course, and there are a few exceptions. I used it as well, but I would say 98% of the games won't be able to run in such a high resolution, as we definitely lack the GPU power. So this is also why I chose 1.5 as the highest value for most of the games today. And I promise the Python at 1.5 is more than enough to make the VR image super sharp, as it renders the game in a resolution much higher than native 4K. Every single benchmark was made with normal field of view, which is around 150 degrees horizontally. Pimax headsets also has a large field of view and a small field of view, but I think normal field of view is the best without going too low on the frame rate. Also, all the games has been benchmarked identically on both the RTX 2080 Ti and also my GTX 1080 Ti, of course, to give you a realistic and fair comparison. The testings were made by short gaming sessions in each game, repeating the same moves and locations very carefully. Throughout these benchmarks, you will see real-time frame rates, average frame rate, CPU and GPU frame times and utilization thanks to the FPS VR application you can find cheap on Steam. For all the benchmark graphs I have made, I have picked the average frame rate as a measurement. The average frame rate is taken from the FPS VR at the end of each session, and the average frame rate counter was of course reset right before each session began. Also, all in-game settings are set by me for an optimal image quality versus performance balance. So have in mind you could go lower on the in-game settings to gain better performance that you will see here, although you will lose a lot of the great looks, which I think is quite important, especially when running games on the high resolution headsets such as Pimax. I just received the GPU, so these benchmarks are the first one that I'm doing with the RTX card, but I promise there will be much more of these videos, especially with VR simulators and those VR games specifically heavy on the GPU. Lastly, the PC rig used in these benchmarks is powered by an Intel i7 8700K processor overclocked to stable 5 GHz on all cores, and the RAM memory is 32 GB of DDR4 sticks clocked at 3800 MHz with cache latency 15, and all games were running off an SSD hard drive of course. Alright, I think I said it all. Now let's get going. Starting off with Arizona Sunshine, a game that really doesn't run well on the Pimax even with a GTX 1080 Ti. It's basically impossible to maintain a stable 90 frames per second or even reaching 80 frames per second on the Pimax 8K, even with Python value at 1.0 and despite going medium to low with in-game settings. Using Python at 1.25 or 1.5 with 1080 Ti is a no-go, as average frame rates goes mostly below 60 frames per second and even down to mid-40s, which I think is too low to fully enjoy this game in VR. On the RTX 2080 Ti, things looks much better with Python at 1.0. We get a mostly stable frame rate of 90 frames per second, and Arizona Sunshine finally becomes a blast, just as I hoped for. But unfortunately, I would say Arizona doesn't look gorgeous at Python at 1.0, as jagged edges are very apparent on distance and the overall image is not sharp enough as I want it to be. Going higher on the Python scale, we immediately see a sudden decrease of around 20 frames per second less, and with Python at 1.5, the performance gets quite unacceptable. Looking at the numbers, the RTX 2080 Ti doesn't look that impressive at all. A frame rate increase of between 14 and 20% is much less than I was expecting. The GPU frame times in these benchmarks are much higher than the CPU frame times, so we can definitely not blame it on the CPU either. Arizona Sunshine might not be the most optimized Unity engine VR game, but I was definitely expecting better performance with my new GPU. Not a great start, I have to say. Moving on, let's try Onward. Onward is a VR game that runs pretty well, and as I shown you in one of my earlier videos, it is fully playable even on a GTX 1070 laptop with quite stable frame rates close to 80 and even 90. Here, using maximum in-game settings including shadows, we have an almost perfect frame rate with both title render quality at 1.0 and 1.25. Once we go 1.5, the frame rate starts to dip and we lose immediately almost 20 frames per second on average. It's still fully playable at around 70s, but the image quality difference going from 125 to 1.5 is not worth the frame loss. I would say don't go higher than 1.25 on a GTX 1080 Ti. On the RTX 2080 Ti, things looks much better, but yet not perfect, I would say. It's 100% stable 90 frames per second on both title 1.0 and 1.25, but once we raise the bar to 1.5, it clearly shows the super high resolutions is just too much even for the RTX cards, going down to low 80s in frame rate. Again, skip 1.5 and stay at 1.25 and you will get a perfect frame rate instead. Of course, you could probably go lower on the shadows to gain some extra frames, as I'm running this game at max settings in all scenarios, which is of course not necessary. All in all, Onward performs quite well on both GPUs, and the minor difference of around 12% frame rate boost using the RTX is hardly noticeable and really at the low end. I was indeed expecting Onward to run fully smooth on the RTX no matter what resolution used, but maybe I was just hoping for too much. Next up, Contagion VR Outbreak, a really cool VR horror game and also the first Unreal Engine game in this test. Unreal Engine is a game engine that most of the time could be a bit heavy on the GPU despite not much being rendered in the view actually. Still on title at 1.0, it's almost fully smooth on the GTX 1080 Ti in my tests. The game looks much sharper running title 1.25 or 1.5 of course, but unfortunately that's when things start to suffer. On title at 1.5 it's still fully playable around mid-50s in frame rate on average. Of course, a lot depends on the area in the game and there are more demanding areas than the corridors inside, but having a look at the RTX numbers we clearly see that it doesn't gain much performance boost. Sure, title 1.0 is stable 90 frames per second of course, but already at 1.25 we start to see frame drops, and with title at 1.5 it's down to mid-70s on average. I was not expecting any great performance from this game though, mostly because the game engine used of course, so I'm not that surprised that even my RTX 2080 Ti gets a tough call here. The performance numbers are quite good though in comparison. The RTX 2080 Ti gains more than 30% in frame rate on the highest title 1.5 setting, which is on par with what we have been expecting I guess. So at least we have a noticeable performance jump on paper. Now Skyrim VR, a VR game that is not really heavy on the GPU, but to be honest, playing it on Pimax you really need to bump up the in-game super sampling to its max, as you will otherwise see a lot of jagged edges and aliasing even on higher title values. In this test I'm running the game on maximum in-game super sampling and a high preset. The GTX 1080 Ti starts to struggle already at title at 1.0, where the frame rate is not really maxed out, even if the frame rate tells you it's very close to 90 at least. Once we go a little bit higher up to title 1.25, the performance starts to drop, and I would say stick to title 1.0 and you will get a much better experience overall, at least almost butter smooth. On the RTX 2080 Ti, we see much better numbers as both Python 1.0 and 125 is more or less butter smooth wherever I go. Starting at 1.5, we see a slight frame drop in mid 80s or low 80s, but it's still a very good experience, and most of the time you will hardly notice the minor frame loss and reprojection. I would say Skyrim doesn't really need full 90 frames per second to be playable, and if you need those extra frames to reach 90 frames per second, you can just lower the in-game super sampling a few steps and you will definitely get a smoother gameplay. Somehow I wonder if Python 1.5 really is needed here. I'm sure most players will enjoy Skyrim at Python 1.0 even, as it really looks great as long as you max in the in-game super sampling. Also note that the performance increase going from 1080 Ti to 2080 Ti is actually around 34% in Python 1.5, which is very good and best so far in this test. Next up, Fallout 4 VR, a game that not only needs an extreme graphic card taken from another galaxy, but also a very fast CPU and RAM memory. And I have never seen this game run smooth on any VR headset without reprojection, and it will definitely not happen today either. I wouldn't say it's unplayable, but it's definitely not a good experience with a GTX 1080 Ti, not even on Python at 1.0, and the higher you go on the resolution, it slowly becomes more frustrating than fun. With frame rates between 30 and 40, Fallout 4 VR is definitely not a blast. And in this test I'm not even using any in-game super sampling at all, it's still on 1.0. Strange enough, it clearly shows that the GPU is the big bottleneck here, looking at the GPU frame times that really spikes. And unfortunately, an RTX 2080 Ti won't help that much either. Sure, it is an acceptable frame rate increase, and on Python at 1.0 you can definitely enjoy Fallout 4 VR with an average frames per second of around 60. And really, I don't know if a faster CPU even helps in this case. And remember, Fallout 4 VR is quite blurry and boring looking unless you go Python 125 or higher, or at least increase the in-game super sampling, which will definitely lower the frame rate even more. The performance jump is somewhere around 20%, which is quite okay, but I was definitely hoping for much more. I guess we will need to wait for another generation of Nvidia or AMD graphic cards until we can enjoy this game with maxed out frame rates. Now let's try out the Forest VR. This game was not made for VR from the start, of course, and you can clearly tell that by the performance. Using a GTX 1080 Ti, we have a hard time reaching even 60 frames per second, and while some areas in the forest might be less demanding for the GPU, overall the average frame rates are extremely low. Going higher than Python 1.0 might sound pointless to you, and I gotta disappoint you saying it looks much better on the higher resolutions. Still, with a frame rate of around 36 and lower, it's definitely not acceptable, and have in mind I'm using a very low in-game settings during these testings, so there is not much you can improve as far as I know. With an RTX 2080 Ti, it gets kind of playable with an average of 60 frames per second with Python at 1.0, but I must say I'm truly disappointed in the RTX 2080 Ti performance in the Forest. This is one of those games that I was really hoping to be able to enjoy on my Pimax, but after this testing session I just got turned down and I can't see myself playing this game in such condition. It really feels stuttery while moving around in the woods, and once you get too many objects or cannibals around you, then it gets even worse. Percentage-wise, looking at the frame rate increase, it still looks quite okay going from a 1080 Ti to a 2080 Ti, but it's far from optimal and definitely not smooth whatever settings you're using. What a shame. Serisan 3 VR is a game that I never got fully smooth on the GTX 1080 Ti, no matter how much I tried to tweak it, not even on Python at 1.0. It is fully playable, I would say, and really great looking already at the lowest resolution, including the in-game super sampling at default 100%, but the real sharpness in the game won't be there unless you go higher on the Python value, which also makes a huge impact in the frame rate. Already at Python at 1.25 you fall around 50 frames per second, which is playable but far from enjoyable, especially once you jump into the fast action with loads of opponents running around you. Aiming becomes frustrating and the free locomotion feels more stuttery than ever before with the frame rate around 50. With the RTX 2080 Ti on the other hand, it's a totally different story. Now we're talking. This is the first game that really games in performance from the RTX monster. Basically, we have a full frame rate on both Python at 1.0 and 1.25, and even at 1.5 it's almost there as well. Series Sam 3 VR really deserves a smooth frame rate, and this is the first time I really enjoyed playing it with all the fast action. Unfortunately, the FPS VR application overlay bugged out while playing this game, so you can't see the real-time frames per second in this video, but at least you can see the total average FPS at the end of each session. The frame rate increases goes all the way up to 67 and 64% on the higher Python values, and this really makes a huge difference. Wow, if only all VR games could benefit from the RTX series such as Series Sam 3 VR does. Seeking Dawn is one of the crazy demanding Unity engine games with loads of effects, making it beautiful but also quite frustrating to play on a GTX 1080 Ti with Pimax. I know the game lacks performance even with other VR headsets, but with Pimax the higher resolution really kills the frame rate. At best, we reach an average of 54 frames per second, and that's not even the most demanding areas we were visiting here. On top of that, the game is a bit blurry on Python at 1.0, and you definitely need to go up to Python at 1.25 until you start to see the potential of the Pimax headsets. It's really a beautiful game overall, but in the end I wish all these effects could just be turned off. I used quite balanced settings in the test, but still I didn't manage to make it both look good and run acceptable on the Pimax with GTX 1080 Ti. And almost same goes for the RTX 2080 Ti. We see an average of mid-60s in frame rate on Python at 1.0, and going above 1.0 is simply impossible as it just gets too stuttery, especially in intense moments. On Python at 1.5 it's barely playable on the RTX card when we hit, well, mid-30s, and while it's really sharp and great looking at such high resolution, I'm not sure even if the next generation of graphic card will be able to handle this game with a proper and enjoyable frame rate. And while the performance jump from the 1080 Ti to the 2080 Ti still is mostly above 20%, you can hardly notice it, and it won't make you a happy gamer, unfortunately. As you can see, the frame rate graph speaks for themselves here. This could be maybe acceptable playing on a monitor, but in VR it's just too low frame rates overall. Hellblade is another example of a beautiful game which recently added VR support that unfortunately lacks the performance just like The Forest. Yes, you could most likely make it smooth on a GTX 1080 Ti on Python at 1.0 going on very low in-game settings, but then you lose the whole atmosphere and beauty of this game, which is fantastic even on medium settings. My GTX 1080 Ti can barely hit 60 frames per second at Python at 1.0 despite some optimized settings, and going higher at the render scale is not an option for me. It's really a shame, as I was once again looking forward to play this game on the Pimax, but I might have to wait a bit longer for optimizations or another Nvidia generation again. Also, for some reason the game just doesn't start at Python at 1.5 and it crashes instantly upon startup. With the RTX 2080 Ti, we actually get a nice boost in frame rate with Python at 1.0 when we hit around 76 frames per second on average, sometimes even reaching 90. Unfortunately, the game needs at least Python 1.25 to really look sharp and great as expected, and while the performance jump from 1080 Ti to 2080 Ti with the Python at 1.25 is actually almost 40%, it's still not enough. The camera moves a lot in this game, and moving a camera in a third-person view is really not a good combination with stutters and can make you motion sick very fast. Again, even with an RTX 2080 Ti, Hellblade crashes instantly when starting with Python at 1.5. Maybe it's the game engine not being able to handle such a resolution, or maybe the VRAM memory or the graphical memory is not enough. Anyways, I really hope I will be able to play this game with high resolution, wide field of view and full frame rate, maybe one day. How about SUPERHOT? Well, SUPERHOT may not be the very demanding VR title, and on Pavlov 1.0 and 1.25 and even 1.5 it runs really great on the GTX 1080 Ti with mostly perfect frame rate. At Pavlov 1.5 we start to see some dips down to mid-80s, but that's definitely not a problem in a game like this, and also that's why I decided to try it with Pavlov 2.0 to see if I can push it even further. Sure, I mean it works, but then we start to see major reprojection and frame rate falls down to mid-70s. For some reason it doesn't even look sharper on the Pavlov 2.0 than it does on 1.5, so I would say there is no point going higher than 1.5 or even 125, as it really makes it sharp with everything above 1.0. On the RTX 2080 Ti, SUPERHOT runs like a dream. No matter if we feed it with Pavlov 1.0 or 2.0, it runs most of the time in maxed out frame rate of 90 frames per second. I'm not sure if the later rooms or locations in game are more demanding, but the first ones that I just played during this test session definitely works great on the Pimax, and it really looks good as well. Running Pavlov 2.0, for some reason there is not much of a difference between the 1080 Ti and 2080 Ti, only 16% increase, which I find a bit strange actually. All in all, SUPERHOT is fully playable on both of these GPUs with super sharp image and super sampling, and that's what's most important. Guys, these were my 10 games in the test, but I also want to add one tiny little bonus. I tried the longbow in the lab on both the GTX 1080 Ti and the RTX 2080 Ti, and I must say I'm really impressed about the optimizations. The game just runs smooth no matter what resolution you throw at it. It's fully playable on both the RTX and the GTX with Pavlov 2.0 with totally maxed out frame rate, and I wish more games could run like this on the Pimax. So guys, you may wonder what are my initial thoughts. Well, I need to admit that I'm quite disappointed in the RTX 2080 Ti performance increase going from the GTX 1080 Ti. The numbers are better of course, and sometimes goes way beyond 30 and even 60, but I was somehow expecting much more. Many games still cannot reach a full frame rate of 90 frames per second, and games which are not really optimized still suffers with low frame rates. Maybe it's the early Nvidia drivers, maybe it's the Pimax render or the Steam VR render that struggles in high resolutions, but using Pimax headsets it just feels quite impossible to reach a stable 90 frames per second in at least half of the games I tried. Well, this may not say much at all in terms of VR performance in general. Let's say if you use an HTC Vive, Oculus Rift or the Windows Mixed Reality headset with the RTX 2080 Ti, but as a daily Pimax user, I guess I will need to wait for another generation to fulfill my needs, or better drivers, or better coded games, forwarded rendering or other optimizations. All in all, this leaves me with a bittersweet taste, as I just spent $1,500 on a GPU that only makes minor upgrade overall. I know, we will get ray tracing sooner or later, and if I one day decide to play a game on my PC monitor, I'm sure the RTX will be more than enough even at 4K resolution. But the question is, would I really recommend the RTX 2080 Ti to Pimax backers and Pimax buyers who already have a GTX 1080 or the 1080 Ti? Well, most likely not, especially considering the extremely high price tag on the RTX cards. Stick with your graphic card for now, lower the in-game settings and spend your money on the games or other fun VR accessories instead. At least until better drivers and optimizations are out and the heavy GPU demanding VR games finally starts to shine on the Pimax. One day we might get there, but I'm afraid that won't happen until we see another Nvidia generation releasing, whenever that might be. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this video was helpful for you and informative. Please let me know what you think in the comments down here below and we can discuss it all together. And also remember, I am gonna keep my GTX 1080 Ti for at least 1 month, maybe 2, to be able to do much more videos like this. I'm gonna of course do benchmarks with VR simulators and much more other games. This was just the beginning, my first benchmark video, a little bit rushed out here in the start when I just received the card, but there is gonna be much more, so stay tuned. And of course, subscribe to my channel and leave a like on this video. If you would like to support me a little bit further, you can join my Patreon and support me with $2 a month. It really means a lot to me. Guys, again, thank you so much, and a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters. I really appreciate your support. And of course, my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin, and VR Ambassador. Have a good day and see you in my next video. Cheers!